Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry. My name is Sébastien Jean. I'm director of CEPII, a Paris-based Center for Research and Expertise in International Economics, and a proud member of the EconPol network from the beginning. And I'm very happy and honored to be moderating this panel on the hot issue of the day, of the year, and possibly of the years to come. I think we don't need much introduction after the excellent speech by Mrs. Wolf-Prexler. She asked, for instance, whether the EU is at risk of being a collateral damage of the present tensions between the US and China. I think that's a very good question to start with. And she also reminded us that the world is not waiting for Europe in that story. I think these are excellent points to start with in this panel devoted to challenges of EU trade policy making. We have obviously daunting challenges today, both in our relationship with the US and in the ensuing dangers and actually existential threat for the multilateral trading system as a whole. So that will be nothing less than this, the topic of our panel today, and we're very extremely lucky to have an outstanding panel of from various horizons. Maria Åsenius is head of cabinet of Commissioner Malmström here at the Commission. Bernd Lange is a member of European Parliament and chair of the Committee on International Trade. And the business representative are on my right, with Andrea Montanino, who's chief economist with Confindustria, and Eckart van Unger, who's a senior manager with BDI. So I think it will make for an outstanding discussion and dialogue between politician representatives, business, which is extremely useful in the present situation. Maria, if you don't mind, I propose that we start with you. I put up a few questions to somehow kickstart the discussion, asking you to define how you define the EU strategy in this very complicated landscape. What are the top priorities? As well, kind of following question, whether we should enter into real negotiation with the US, knowing that we're now supposed to be in discussions but not in negotiation. Also whether the present situation is useful perhaps in creating some leverage with respect to the multilateral trading system, and how could we try to use that if this is the case? Up to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sébastien. Yeah, we have a lot on our plate right now. So when it comes to EU priorities, I'd like to highlight maybe 3 sets of issues here today that I think we have to focus a lot on this last year in this Commission mandate. Number 1, save the World Trade Organization. Number 2, get good bilateral deals in place. And number 3, manage relations with the United States. So let me elaborate a little bit on these 3 pieces. Save the WTO. Well, this is of course paramount because the international rules-based system is facing its deepest crisis since the end of World War II. The rules at its core are increasingly being challenged, including by one of the major players that was instrumental in building this very multilateral order. So what shall we do? Well, we have to modernize the rule book. And as you know, the EU is a leading advocate of open rules-based trade with the WTO at its center. Over decades, we have built a stable framework, clear set of rules that create stability for our businesses, certainty in the economy. Doing away with the WTO would really be only increase confrontation, lead to anarchy and chaos, and replace right by might. However, we need to acknowledge that the rules of today are not really properly addressing some of the problematic behaviors that we see in certain emerging economies, read China. And I'm thinking in particular of massive industrial subsidies, forced technology transfers, and the distortions that are created by state-owned enterprises and of overcapacity. So therefore, I'm happy that we are engaged in meetings, trilateral meetings now, EU, US, Japan, where we work on new rules that can kind of fill the gaps in the WTO rule book. And we actually also have a bilateral working group, EU-China, that are working on WTO reform issues. It was set up at the summit this past July. And for those who are really trade nerds, you may have noticed that on DG Trade's website you can find, it was put there in the middle of September, a paper that set out some preliminary ideas on what we want to change. And it's all about, about rule changes, it's about using current rules better when it comes to monitoring, for example, and it is also ideas on how to break the imminent deadlock of the dispute settlement system in Geneva, because we are in a quite serious situation as concerns the appellate body. There are only 3 arbitrators left. 4 seats are empty because the US have been blocking new arbitrators from taking these seats. And you need 3 arbitrators to work on any case. And if there is a conflict of interest, or if somebody should get sick for a long time, it means that already today it's impossible to take cases forward in the appellate body. And it will, of course, come to a complete standstill by the end of next year, when 2 more arbitrators' mandates will run out, and we will be left with only 1 person. So there we really have to break this deadlock, because without enforcement, the rules become meaningless. Our second big task, as I was saying, it is to get ambitious bilateral trade deals in place. And I think especially today, in this shaky global context, it is very smart to diversify and have several reliable partners with whom we can trade. And bilateral agreements with like-minded countries help us manage the impact of globalization, and it also sends a powerful signal to the rest of the world that we are committed to well-regulated markets, open and fair rules. And of course, this brings considerable benefits to the EU economy. And with the background also knowing that in the next 10-15 years, 90% of growth will take place outside European borders, it is important to connect to that that growth in other parts of the world. And all this makes our bilateral trade agreements and relations all the more important. And that explains why our agenda is busier than ever. And I'm therefore very happy that we managed to close negotiations with Japan rather fast, and that there was a positive vote in the Intern committee earlier this month. Because this trade agreement between the EU and Japan is the biggest one we have ever agreed to, accounting for more than 1/4 of the world's GDP. And there are also positive developments as regards our trade agreement with Singapore. I hope that will be voted also soon. Vietnam, Mexico, and we keep working with Chile and with the Mercosur countries. We are making good progress also with New Zealand and Australia after the launch this summer. So all in all, good. But we also have to manage our relations with the US while protecting European interests and base ourselves on rules and without resorting to protectionism. And this is what we are doing. You remember in July when the US unilaterally decided to slam tariffs on steel and aluminium on Europe and the rest of the world, by the way. The Commission immediately launched legal proceedings in the WTO against the US. We put in place rebalancing measures on a number of US products, and we adopted steel safeguards to protect EU producers from redirected foreign imports. But Sébastien, you asked the question, should we enter into real negotiations with the United States? Well, the Commission is committed to take forward all the work strands that was agreed in the July meeting between President Trump and President Juncker, including the idea of slashing tariffs on industrial goods. But before we do those real negotiations, we should do a scoping exercise together with the United States where we agree on the level of ambition for this agreement. There is no point in starting before we have sufficient clarity on a common ground as regards the level of ambition. And the US is actually not ready to do this scoping yet, but we are ready whenever they are ready. I think I shouldn't hide maybe that the US still keeps hoping that agriculture should be included in such an agreement, but we answer that has been said very clearly from EU member states that that is clearly ruled out. And the joint statement of 25th of July is also very clear. It says that negotiations should focus on non-auto industrial tariffs. So what we have been doing so far since July is to focus our work with the US instead on voluntary regulatory cooperation based on 3 clear principles from our side, namely that this is a voluntary regulatory cooperation and that it must be of mutual interest. There must be full respect for the respective domestic legal and regulatory procedures. I mean, we are not going to entirely change our system here. And we have to maintain the current levels of protection. And we have to also be able to be transparent and accountable to all interested stakeholders. And over all these discussions and talks, we have, of course, one dark cloud looming, and that is the ongoing US investigation, 232 investigations on cars and car tariffs. We don't know when this investigation will be done, should be done before mid-February, we assume. But nobody knows for sure, and nobody knows what the decision would be after that. I mean, first there is a recommendation from the Commerce Department, or Department of Commerce, and then we'll see what the President decides. And of course, if we should be slammed with car tariffs or tariffs on car parts as well, I think that would clearly destroy the prospect of a positive agenda, and we would have to reassess our relationship. Then quickly, maybe to your last question, which was, would I say that the US activity is creating leverage and to change things in the WTO? And I think the most positive thing I can say is that there is a growing understanding within the wider WTO membership that status quo is not attainable. Things have to change. We have to reform. But at the same time, these US unilateral WTO non-consistent measures are deepening the crisis within the WTO and actually risk putting the entire system into collapse. And this is very bad. So while we strongly disagree with the US on methods, we share many of the concerns. And I mentioned in the beginning some of the tensions that we need to address, the new rules that are needed. Notably the trade distortions that are caused by non-market policies and practices, the industrial subsidies, etc. But we think that the solution lies in reforming within the WTO rather than acting outside of the rules-based system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria, for your very complete answer, wide-ranging and at the same time focusing specifically on your priority, and I think that's very useful to frame the debate in a useful manner. The dialogue between the Commission and the European Parliament is one of the pillars of governance in European affairs and in trade in particular. So perhaps, Bernd, you could tell us how you react, how you see this strategy as well from your point of view, and as well how you react to the Commission position as presented just now by Maria.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sébastien. Ladies and gentlemen, looking to the trade on a global scale, I think you have to have a picture of a coin in your mind. On the one hand, on the one side of the coin, you have more and more global value chain. Around about 70% of trade is linked to global value chain. And because of that, tariffs are not playing the most important role anymore. The question of regulatory cooperation, of standards, of SPS, of labor rights, environmental rights are much more important. And of course, this is raising a greater awareness in the public debate. So this is the key of modern trade policy, and therefore comprehensive trade agreements, transparency, by the way, that's also really important, transparency and dialogue with business, with civil society is key to this side of the coin. And of course, more multilateral arrangement in these fields. And the other side of the coin is indeed protective measures, undermining multilateral rules. And this is indeed based in the United States at the moment. And I really try to understand what is the strategy of the United States. And I think two elements I see. One is breaking the global value chain and relocation of production in the United States. So contrary to the reality of trade today. And the second is to keep China small. And you can elaborate this in several aspects of the whole exercise. Both are not in our interests because of global value chain, because of business with China, because of the multilateral system. So perhaps I'm a little bit more skeptical towards the possibility with the United States to find a common ground. So on negotiations with the United States, what is the idea behind? So as said, normally we want to have a comprehensive agreement, and I spent a lot of my lifetime in the TTIP negotiation, unfortunately without any success. But this was our clear approach, and I think it is reflecting the necessities of trade today. And at the moment, the United States are not really willing to go ahead. And secondly, they are threatening us. So with the steel tariffs and the aluminum tariffs and the possible tariffs on cars, so negotiate under threat. I'm not sure that this is the right way to proceed. And what is the aim of the United States? If it really is to break value chain and relocate it, production to the United States, then they have a specific interest also in negotiations. And look to the reformed NAFTA, the NAFTA 2.0, the USMCA. And in the side letters, they integrated this threat with tariffs on cars, this 232, because in an institutional arrangement with Mexico and linked to a quota. Both are really undermining the multilateral ruling system, is totally not in line with WTO rules. So I think this can't be accepted by the European Union. So I'm a little bit skeptical that this will be really have a positive result. And yes, we have some bilateral agreements to reflect these possibilities of necessities of a modern trade. For example, Japan, yeah. And even the Japanese government was asking me, what is Juncker and Trump doing? So you, as European Union, ask for a clear commitment on precaution principle, on public services, and on labor standards and environment standards. And now we are going in negotiations with the United States without all these elements. Why you request this from Japan and not from the United States? And to be open, I can't give really a concrete answer to that, beside calming down the relation to the United States. So I think we should really stick to our position. And Then on the global aspects, yes, we should really try to secure the multilateral system, the WTO. And I appreciate very much some proposals for improving the rule book, improving the appellate body, and also improving the working method. European Commission did some work, Canada did some work, the European Parliament is probably adopting tomorrow a report on that. But I'm convinced that we should try to keep all partners under the tent, US and China. So I think the second strategy of the United States to keep China small, even through some reforms of WTO, is not in our interest. So we should really establish a framework for modernization of WTO, which keep both big partners under the tent, and this is the duty for the next year, I guess.
Thank you very much. This notwithstanding a very challenging agenda, and we'll discuss it further, but it's I think there is wide agreement that this is plan A for Europe, reforming, salvaging the WTO while reforming it. The point is how to do that, and perhaps also to some extent what is plan B. Now turning to you, I think it's very interesting at this point to hear also from the private sector representative, whom you are, what are your expectations from from the policy side? Also, as well, what is your feeling and what is at stake for firms in the EU at large and in your country specifically, Italy and Germany respectively? Can you feel it already, and how in the firms you're representing, in terms possibly of investment project delayed, in terms of the business climate? So, Andrea, why don't we start with you? Thanks for being.
Thank you very much. I have a few slides. I don't know whether I can play from here to make it easy. So, thank you for your question. I'd like to develop on three things. First, give you a few figures and numbers to explain how important is the debate we are having now for Italy. Second, how protectionism is affecting the country so far. And third, recommendations, say, for trade policy makers. On the first point, I don't think it works. Anyway, Italy is one of the largest exporting countries in the world. Our share of export, our export as a share of GDP is above 31%. It's second in the G7 countries only to Germany. The current account balance in Italy is the Italian current account balance is the third largest surplus among the G7 countries. So it's extremely important for us to keep going on trade and free trade, because, I mean, in order to understand Italian GDP growth, you cannot avoid looking at the export side, the trade side. Everybody's focusing on the internal problems, but I would say look also at the impact of external turbulences can have on the country. One of the reasons why trade grew a lot in Italy and represents that now at least more than 1/3 of our GDP is because Italian trade grew in quality. If you look at the okay, it's working. So I'll go directly to this slide. This slide is an indicator of quality of export. and it shows a ratio between unit values and export prices. You see that Italy, comparing with other major countries in Europe, had the fastest increase in quality in export. What does it mean? It means that within the same sector, Italy started selling more goods of high unit value. So in the car industry, for instance, more Ferraris and less Fiat, just to make an easy example. Or it shifts to sectors where there is more value added in. So this process started long ago, it's continuing, and Italy is not just, food fashions, the usual thing we have in mind when we talk about Italy. This is why protectionism matters for the countries and worries a lot. We know that all the discussion so far is about US and China. Donald Trump wants to rebalance the deficit, the trade deficit they have with China, but is affecting also European countries. It's already a serious issue. Look at this table. I don't want you to read all the things in, but this is a timetable since January 2018 and shows, starting from what the US administration has done, all the measures and rebalancing measures that are going back and forth between United States, Europe, and China. This table shows to me how complicated is the whole discussion about trade and how many things are happening. This is just the last 9 months, okay? There are, I think, 18, 19 events in these tables. And tariffs already in force are affecting, as you know, global trade, and might affect global trade even more in the future. So the way Italy is affected by protectionism, by these things, is in 3 ways. First, directly. There are tariffs, of course, on steel and aluminium that affect Italian companies directly. But this is not the most important part to me. It's much more important what is happening, say, indirectly. If tariffs affect one of our main trading partners, this has an impact on Italy. So take Germany, for instance. Italy exports to Germany 60 billion euros of goods every year. Most of it is intermediate goods, components, machineries, equipment, that go into German goods. And the greatest part of the Italian components are in German goods that are produced for export, not for the internal market. So if German trade is affected, if German exports are affected by protectionism, Italian business suffer immediately because of the link we have with the country. The third way that protectionism is affecting the country, directly, indirectly, and is also on confidence, as you mentioned. The protectionism measures affect increased uncertainty over global order, and therefore this reduce investment plans. And in the country, in Italy, we are already seeing the confidence of entrepreneurs, of firms, is declining. There might be internal reasons for that, but there are also external reasons. The fact that Italian companies see a lot of disorder in global trade is limiting or reducing their investment plans, and especially their plans to organize to export more. To hire people that speak English, just to give an example. If you know that it will be much more difficult to export, maybe you avoid investing in human capital to develop a business abroad. So my suggestion for trade policy makers, here is a list. Oh, this is, I think, is a nice chart just to show where are the main hub in global supply chain, and you see Germany, US, and China are the 3 most relevant, and that's why for us Italians and for Europe it's important to preserve our hub and the role that European Union countries have in the global value chain. So recommendation for policymakers. This is a slide that try to make a sort of a list of topics. I don't want to go through all of that, but just let me focus on number 5 about the United States, because I think this is extremely important given the fact that the United States is our main trading partner, European Union countries. I think key is to achieve results with the United States on non-tariff barriers, because this has a huge impact on the small, medium enterprises that can't afford compliance costs, organizational costs to export in a country where there are non-tariffs barrier. And to be successful in a sort of a next round of discussion or negotiation, compare with previous experiments that failed, the Transatlantic Economic Council and the TTIP, I suggest 3 things. First, start small. Do not focus on big things. Try to focus on areas where there is already a common agreement, there is already common ground among regulators, and try to achieve some results on that. Second, take on new technologies. Usually, the discussion has been focused so far on more traditional goods. But on more traditional goods, there is already a lot of regulation and a lot of, confrontation among the 2 countries. I spent my last 5 years in Washington, D.C., and the main discussion was about chicken at the end of the day. And so if you want to solve the chicken issue with the United States, it won't be possible. So let's look at new areas. So for instance, there are no rules already for autonomous vehicles. Let's work on building a set of rules that reduce non-tariff barriers on autonomous vehicles, on alternative fuel. So areas where there is new things. I think this can help. And the third, and the third point, and I finish, is to respect existing regulatory process. Don't give the impression that you do new things, but work through national regulators and within same process. I finish with one word, and it's a pessimistic word on the United States. Last Friday, there was a very interesting article on the Wall Street Journal talking about a one-page advertisement bought by Donald Trump against trade, and in particular against trade with Japan. This advertisement was dated 1987, 31 years ago. So Mr. Trump, already 31 years ago, had a very clear view about trade, and he bought a page on the Wall Street Journal to say that they didn't want to have trade with Japan. Now it's not Japan, it's China. The problem is the same. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was also in the Boston Globe and in the Washington Post, and that he spent $100,000 at the time to publish this letter to the general public. And so famously, it was apparently his response to Woodward, as he reports it, to Bob Woodward, reported in his book, why does he like tariff as he does? And apparently his reply was, but I've been doing so for a very long time. So apparently the time consistency must be an answer in that respect. So I think it will be interesting to hear both of you, Maria and Bernd, about this recommendation of re-engage with the US in a pragmatic manner, and but that will be perhaps for the discussion afterwards. Eckart, how does it feel from the point of view of German industry in particular and European more at large?
Yeah, thank you, Sébastien, for your question, and thank you for the organizer for having me. I'd like to focus my introduction on the US, but I'm happy to engage in other areas as well during the debate. And I'd like to start with a quote. "The Germans are bad, very bad. Look at the millions of cars they sell in the US. Terrible, we'll stop that." So it's in the same direction as you said, Andrea. It sounds funny, but if you take notes that he means it, he's serious about his trade policy, it's less funny, and it demonstrates a little bit that we as German manufacturing, we are quite in the focus of his trade policy, and then of course with us also the whole European trade agenda. So there's a lot of at stake, and since there are several scientists here, I'd like to feed you with some figures. Most of you know that we are very dependent on exports in Germany, on exports. Every 1 in 4 jobs is dependent on exports, and in our manufacturing sector, it's more than every second job that depends on exports, and the US is our largest export market. Our largest business partner with imports is China, but the US is very important in terms of exports, and if you take the extra EU exports of Germany, the US makes almost 30%. So it's huge for us. And since he is very focused on cars, our German car makers sell 1.3 million cars in the US in last year. And 1/3 were directly exported from Germany to the US, but most of the cars we sell in the US are produced in the US. So it's not that we export everything from Germany. So I think we can also say that the US is very much benefiting also from our trade relations. We, as German business, we have more than 5,000 subsidiaries in the US, employing about 800,000 people. So it's pretty much, and we are the 4th largest investor in the US. So it's a mutual beneficial exchange, and we don't share obviously the view on trade that is currently proposed by the US government. Of course, North America is also kind of hub for our business, as was demonstrated in your slide. 60% of the cars produced in the US are sold outside of the US. So there's also a close link between our manufacturing between Mexico and the US. So the trade policy of Trump is currently putting a lot at risk, and this might really impact our profitability, but also where we have our jobs in our internationalized businesses. Well, do we already feel the consequences of the trade agenda of Donald Trump and the trade conflicts? Our companies in the US, they have been enthusiastic about the tax reform, of course, and the economy was running quite well in the US, but I think the business mood has deteriorated since then. There's a lot of insecurity about the future, and we in the latest outlook I know about among German companies outside Germany, the business climate really deteriorated since spring. So it's already in the insecurity and the problems, they are already pretty real. If you have a look at the trade agreement that Bernd Lange mentioned in North America, the USMCA, the trade among the North American partners becomes more difficult. And although there are certain positive aspects in there as well, I think the structure already tells us that it's highly likely that we will have higher car import tariffs to the US market. Otherwise, as Bernd Lange said, the structure doesn't make much sense. So it's very concerning for us. And the trade conflict with China, between US and China, has already escalated to a certain level. And I'd like to tell you about a survey made among our chamber network. 4 in 10 German companies in China already feel the consequences in their exports of this trade conflict. And every second company in the US is already affected in their exports via this conflict between China and the US. And it's even more substantial if you look at the imports. So German companies producing in the US are importing a lot from China, but obviously also from the EU, and so the problems are already there and take a toll. There's also, of course, an effect on how our companies invest, and in China, already 1/3 of our companies think about relocation of production, and I think every 4th company in the US is thinking about relocating production because of these conflicts. So it's pretty real. It has been mentioned, the US introduced tariffs on steel and aluminum. There is a direct impact on our businesses, of course. Our exports in the first 6-7 months this year to the US was reduced by 7%, and I mean, the largest effect is probably by a trade diversion. So other countries in the neighborhood of Europe who can't sell their steel to the US anymore because of the tariffs, they are looking for other markets, especially also Europe. So we see, for instance, the exports from Turkey to Europe increasing by 43%, while the Turkish exports of steel to the US are declining by 50%. So there are already real impacts, and I just want to mention that, of course, there's also direct impact of the US sanctions via Russia and Iran that is affecting our companies. So if I might if I have the time, I can also say a little bit on what we expect from policymakers, of course. I mean,
yes,
Bernd
Lange
and Åsenius are doing a tremendously important job.
To say that in 1 or 2 minutes.
We welcome, of course, that there is a dialogue with the US, and we should continue this dialogue and to build up trust and to build a basis for trade negotiations. And in our view, it's important to have this positive agenda. Maybe as a kind of disclaimer, we are currently reviewing our position on certain elements of the trade agenda. This is probably ahead of us. So, but I'm pretty safe to say that for us, it's NTBs are very important, but also tariffs still matter. And while there's a kind of disappointment among our membership that there is no broad and comprehensive agenda anymore, we certainly have to accept the realities, but we ask the Commission to really fight for WTO compliance. If you look at the tariffs, it would mean to cover substantially all trade, and to do the best to avoid quotas. And we as German industry, we are prepared to reduce all tariffs or eliminate them. So we are looking forward to what is in the pipeline there. On regulatory cooperation, I think the EU have tabled certain ideas that are good, and we can build on what we already have with the GMP agreement on pharma. But in our membership, we hope that more is possible, at least it's maybe not a low-hanging fruit, but more in the medium term. We used to talk about automotive. We used to talk about mechanical engineering, electronics, and these are certain areas that are very close to our membership and very important. And I mean, there are a lot of key issues that usually belong into a trade agreement that are not on the agenda at the moment. Just to mention procurement, I know the political situation is not like that right now, but I mean, there's a long list that is not covered by current talks. On the steel and aluminum imports, I mean, our exports to the US, also on cars, they are certainly not threatening the national security in the US, so we are very much against this, and we hope that the Commission and our member states still can care for this, and this will be abandoned very soon. I'm quite sure that this will not drop off the bilateral agenda. And I appreciate a lot that Maria mentioned the WTO as number one. This is very close to our heart. We stay multilateralists, as I mentioned. We export much more to the rest of the world than compared to the US, and it's very difficult to rebuild something like the WTO once it is broken. So I think it's very important to keep the US engaged in this debate and try to reform as much as possible. And I think the G20 summit at the end of this month is also important in this regard to have a kind of signal from in this area. Maybe last but not least, what we expect on the EU itself. I mean, as mentioned before, we have a very ambitious trade agenda outside the United States, and we are very supportive. But we also agree with Chancellor Merkel by saying we should, as Europe, become a bit more independent, and we have to build. I mean, that's a task for next decade maybe or longer. To be more independent in terms of foreign affairs, in defense, but also in the financial system, trade financing. So the sanction issue demonstrated a lot how vulnerable we are, and there's a lot to do. And we, as BDI, we are so very supportive on the way to have a stronger European Union. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Eckart. I think it's certainly very illustrative of the times that both of you from the business sector are referring to geopolitics as really part of the agenda for the policy of the policy agenda from your point of view. Certainly, it's very typical of the situation we are in. I also note that you've not been talking much about China. Any of you, perhaps later on in the discussion, you can say how it maps in the picture, in particular in relation with Chinese industrial policy. For instance, in the car sector, for electric vehicles, and that's an important part of the story. Perhaps before we take a bunch of questions, you would like to quickly react, Maria and Bernd, to this?
Happy to comment on the recommendations. Yes, thank you. So if I quickly talk about Andrea's recommendations, first, re-engage with the US. Well, I'd say that we are, notably through the high-level executive working group that is led by Commissioner Malmström and the USTR Lighthizer. He said we should start small on areas where we have common ground, and that is also exactly what we are doing. We are now building a bit on work that was done under TTIP, see where we find candidates for that are suitable and where there is a common interest. Just to give you an example of something that already exists. Since a year we have decided that we can trust each other's inspections of factories that produce human medicine. And that is worth a lot, because that means we don't have to do time-consuming and costly double inspections, because we say that we trust what the US inspectors, the work they are doing, and they trust what our inspectors are doing. And that's really valuable for both sides without making anybody more unsafe. So we are now looking for more candidates where we have a common ground and a mutual interest. And I think it is true to say, I also agree with Andrea, and this is a lesson learned from TTIP. It is very difficult. Once we have already set legislation in stone here in Europe, and they have set things in stone in the US, it's very difficult to approach standards. So therefore it makes a lot of sense to look at future standards. And you suggested, Andrea, that we should look at modern cars or not autonomous cars, for example. And I agree 100%, but I can reveal that so far there is no real enthusiasm in the US for this. And I think that they, frankly, would be afraid of the competition, that they want to have a bit special rules so that they can, for protectionist purposes. I think they are wrong, and I think that we should really, really, really set standards together. EU-US could set global standards together, and we fail to do that. It could be the Chinese who write the rules for the future. So we will continue to get them enthusiastic about this, but so far I don't sense that we are there, unfortunately. And why don't we do something bigger? Well, I think that public procurement and if we want to be realistic, if we want to be able to really deliver, I think we shouldn't go back to take TTIP out of the freezer. I think it's a non-starter, especially after the changes, law changes we have seen in the US on Buy American. They have become even more entrenched and difficult when it comes to public procurement. So I think we should stick to something that we really can deliver, that is still worthwhile. It's not super big, but it's worthwhile. Yeah, maybe stop there.
Thank you. It takes two to tango, and our partner is not a very easy one. Yes, please, Bernd.
Indeed, perhaps he is liking another kind of dancing. Huh? On the regulatory cooperation, the dialogue. Yes, of course, it's better to have talks than fights or war. No doubt about. So I'm not against any talks. And yes, there are all small improvements and so some recognition in the regulatory cooperation. But the whole car sector is excluded from the talks. So, because you're quite right, there is a question of competition. And this was also a lesson learned by TTIP. Huh? So on the crash test, nobody can say that the crash test in Europe is better or more secure than the crash test in the United States. But they are different, and it's a question of competition. That's the truth. And I don't see at the moment that we will really overcome this situation. So there might be some elements where we can find some common understanding, and let's do it so that we can calm down a little bit the situation and avoid further escalation. But this might be complicated. So I have had the doubtful pleasure to discuss with so-called US diplomats in the last 2 weeks, with 2 of them. And they told me very clear that if we would not accept their conditions, one said to me, then please put your safety belt on because thunder is coming. And the others told to me, this case in WTO against the steel tariffs was not really reflected. It's not in the interest of your national security. So they mixed indeed some elements of our relation into this trade issue. And of course we discuss also on Nord Stream 2 and some other issues as well. So I'm not really very optimistic that we can find beyond this regulatory discussion agreement on tariffs and perhaps beyond. But nevertheless, talk is better than fight or war.
Yeah, it's a good pragmatic attitude to begin with. I think we can now open the discussion to any of you wanting to ask a question or state a remark. Please just introduce yourself before we'll be picking up a few of them, and then I'll let Andrea and Eckart follow up on the discussion. So please.
I got the microphone.
Microphone is coming.
Okay. Thank you very much for the great discussion. Adam Bartha, Epicenter Network. My question would be around protectionism in Europe. So I think you discussed a lot of the protectionist policies on the American side, on some of the Chinese side. But when it comes to free trade negotiations, do you see that there are some policies where we ought to modify our own legislation and our own regulatory framework, most notably in the agriculture sector or when it comes to environmental policies, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. Please. And then
Harold Benink, professor at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. I would have a question to Andrea Montanino. I was intrigued by what you were saying, the Italian exports and the connectedness with Germany. So many of your exports go to Germany. Well, we know that we are at the top of the economic cycle, so economic growth also in Germany can be expected to slow down. We saw some numbers already last week. But more importantly, if these trade escalations are going to, this trade dispute with the United States is going to escalate, as some of you are fearing, then that will impact negatively even more German economic growth, but in particular also Italy. Well, we know that we are in a very fragile political situation with Italy in the current situation. So what, also politically speaking, what would you think would be the implications if these bad scenarios would become, say, truth? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be taking 3 more, and please, sir, there, over there, and then here, Simon.
Thank you, Lars Hogard, formerly with the Commission. It was me who closed down the $50 million exports of chlorinated chicken, so I wasn't a very popular person in DC at the time. And I can only therefore recommend, also in relation to the TTIP discussion, that it's not a good strategy to take it out of the freezer, as you said, because it immediately raises the tension on the US side in terms of the protectionist attitude, and this was a little bit the question that was raised here from my side here. So the piecemeal approach, the small steps, is the only way forward. What I would like to raise is, in terms of what Mr. Lange said, is that in terms of the strategic discussion, I think it's wrong to focus too much on the US side. Of course, it's an irritant, and we know Trump and his methods, his way of raising stakes, a zero-sum game, just to get some negotiating trips. It's irritating, it creates uncertainty and all that. But I think in the end you can deal with him if you have something to offer, and we do have things to offer. The more strategic problem is China. China is where the US and the EU and Japan have a common interest. And they have a global strategy of undermining, basically, the world trade system, in the sense that, they talk about safeguarding the multilateral system, the WTO and all that, but that's only paying lip service. His interest lies on exports, keeping markets open for Chinese exports. They're just as protectionist, or even more, we know, on the import side, in terms of stealing intellectual property, the forced investments and all that. And we have to take a strategic view on terms of what the Chinese are doing on their investments in Europe and around the world, where they're trying to gain influence. So we have to really focus on the long term and not be too distracted by the irritant US. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Yes, hello, Hans von der Burchardt, I'm with Politico. Question to Mrs. Åsenius. Mr. Lange and also Mr. Unger raised this issue of car quotas, and especially the relocalization of the high value-added production, the value chains to the United States, the relocalization. How do you assess this in these preparative talks with the US? Is Commissioner Malmström giving a clear nay, a Swedish nay to the US on this point? And maybe just on the WTO, you mentioned that as the steel and aluminium tariffs already came, that you went forward and challenged them at the WTO. We are now one step ahead. We're actually going to have a dispute. But this was always the sort of a common consensus to not have WTO rulings or not seek WTO rulings on national security. It's a bit considered as opening Pandora's box. Can the WTO issue on the issue rulings on the question of national security? So are we actually going to open this Pandora's box? Are we going to go ahead despite the risk that then the WTO might break up, that the United States might completely withdraw? Because I think you cannot issue rulings on our national security. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question for the time being. Yes, Simon.
So I'm Simon Evenett from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. You can probably guess from my accent that I'm not Swiss, but I will ask my question anyway. I was very happy to hear about the injection of realism in the last couple of comments from the panel. On Plan A, which appears to be trying to deal with China, if we're going to negotiate new disciplines with China, what are we going to put on the table? Are we going to put on the table the increasingly dubious practices of the European Investment Bank? Are we going to put on the table the KfW, Development Bank from Germany? Are we going to put on the table the various investment funds from the French and Italian governments, which put capital injections into firms which are in trouble? What is Europe going to offer to that type of negotiation? Because when it comes to negotiating between the boundaries of the state and the private sector, things aren't always as clear and transparent in Europe as we like to think, even if they are rather untransparent in Germany. Sorry, in China. Sorry about that last slip. Then when it comes to Plan B, if Plan A doesn't work and we're left with a rather aggressive American government dealing with the WTO, when are we going to start accepting that we can't keep the current trading system as it is with the full set of rules? I was at the French WTO conference last Friday, where for the first time I heard public international lawyers actually talking about what steps back from the WTO DSU system they're willing to accept and talk about. So which ones are we prepared to, what elements of this system do we need to defend? What are we prepared to give up? Because I suspect, although we like to talk about Plan A, in reality we'll be dealing with Plan B rather soon.
Or Plan C, perhaps, at the end of the day. Thank you, Simon. So I think the plates are already pretty full to to fit the additional remarks. Andrea, do you want to pick up some of these points? Yes. Perhaps the one on Italy.
Well, I take on three points. First, on China, I agree. It's really strategic for Europe and United States to find a common grounds to bring China on the right directions in terms of foreign direct investment or investment to China, etc. But to me, the main problem is that both the United States and Europe are currently not ready to take a leadership, because you need a strong leadership now to, in a way, face China. I'll give you just an example. I was at the International Monetary Fund, okay? So I know the organization pretty well. And the organization works in a way that the United States usually have a view. Europeans, broadly speaking, agree with the United States, and there is a strong common approach between the United States and Europe. This was up to probably a couple of years ago. Now you have the United States didn't appoint their executive director in the IMF, so they don't care about multilateralism. This is the view. The Europeans are not able to agree on a single chair, a Eurozone single chair, whatever. So to find a way to join forces. So what I see in the IMF is what probably is happening in global economic governance. United States and Europe are not ready to lead. And of course, in this situation, the Chinese are taking the leads. So, but I agree with you. It's important to look in the long term. On your question, I think, if I understand well, I think, again, in terms of the longer term, Europe should rethink completely the state aid rules. Because we designed state aid rules thinking about competition between Italy and France, Germany and the Netherlands and whatever. Now the competition is between Europe, China, Europe, United States, and so on. So we should think about different rules. I mean, think about during the crisis. I mean, the American administration was able to put on the table $1 trillion immediately. These were state aids, okay? we as Europeans weren't able. What we did at the beginning of the crisis, each country tried to do some measures for the automotive sector, for instance, in order to help the industry in 2008, 2009. But there was not a common approach because of the state aid rules. So it needs to probably to think about that. On Italy, I think there is a lot of political uncertainty around the world. The Brexit, the German government, Italy, Turkey, Argentina, United States, I can continue. And political risks now are much higher than, say, economic risk, but they are affecting the economy. So if there is now an economic slowdown in Europe, as the Commission already told us in the latest forecast, in such a weak political environment in some European countries, including Italy, can be extremely dangerous. In other words, if there is another crisis somewhere now, I think European leaders and European politicians, European governments and the US government are not on the same line to solve the problems. They were much more united in 2008. The G7 in Toronto, 2 weeks after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, was able to deliver. I think if you have another G7 after a new crisis of someone, I don't think leaders will be able to deliver.
Thank you. Eckart?
I'd like to come in on China, because you also mentioned it. I think there has been a rise of protectionism around the world. The number of barriers have been rising and rising, but our exports have been increasing. So it's a concern, and a big concern in some regards. But I mean, I also see the systemic issue with China. It's a more strategic and an important issue in the long run. And it has been said, of course, that the US, okay, it will always be market economy, it will be an open democracy, and so on. So we won't have this big systemic issue in the long run. And I certainly can support this thesis, but it's of course a more pressing issue in the short term. But we should, in my view, engage with the US to solve this short-term issues. And I think it's extremely important to engage with the US to keep the multilateral system in some regard. I'm not sure whether we can really modernize it as the European Union has proposed, but I think this was extremely helpful and clever to put something on the table that regards all three pillars of the WTO, the rulemaking, the monitoring, but also the dispute settlement, because it's maybe the most urgent thing to do. But in the long run, the competition of our companies in market economies with state capitalist countries like China, it's the more challenging part. And the WTO is probably the best forum to address these issues, but as has been mentioned, the appetite of reforming the WTO in many developing countries is pretty limited. It's a very tough negotiation, and maybe we need something like a two-speed process. If you can avoid the collapse of the system, it would be probably the way to go to commit with the most important countries on tougher rules on subsidies, on notification, on these kind of issues that help to level the playing field. But I've been to Geneva 3 times this year. It's very complicated, and I can only support what the EU has been doing so far on WTO. I think it was very good to address specifically the concerns of the United States, because they are currently most problematic. But I don't see. We need the coalition with the United States, with Japan, with other players to convince China to do more, because so far they have been not very constructive to do big steps forward in Geneva. So it's a pretty complex problem, but I think we have to deal now with the United States, but in the longer view, in the midterm view, it's much more important to do something to have a level playing with China. And it also concerns ourselves in the EU. We also have to look for our own competition rules and what we can do on the external dimension, how trade policy can contribute even more to level the international playing field. So it's not only that we have to cooperate with partners, but also to maybe revise a little bit what we are doing in the EU on competition. Thank you.
And referring to the last question, what do you expect policymakers to be putting on the table from the EU point of view in these negotiations about trade rules in the multilateral arena?
As I said, the discussion paper by the EU, I think it covers the most urgent issues. It is not covering what we are doing kind of in the plurilateral area, for instance, on trade facilitation or e-commerce. I think it's also important, but what is discussed in this plurilateral fora is kind of on a very basic level. But if you want to solve the more structural issues, you have to go to the problems we are having currently on the three pillars affecting the competition, and also affecting whether the US is going to support the system in the future or not.
Thank you. Who wants to start? Maria, please.
Thank you.
There were a few questions directed specifically to you, I guess.
Yeah, I think one question was, what about protectionism in Europe, for example, agriculture? And yes, it's true that that is a sector that gets support, but at least we have reformed the CEPII in such a way that it is now much less trade distortive. Most of our support is in the so-called green box, so I'm not too embarrassed about that. And then on this wider big issue, don't focus so much on US, focus on China. Well, we are focusing a lot on China because what is creating a lot of the tensions in the global trading system today is the way China behaves and the lack of a level playing field. And it didn't matter so much when China was a small economy. But now that China has grown in such a fantastic way, and to a large extent you have to admire them for what they have done, but because a lot of it is also hard work and more education, and congratulations. But they are also doing it through means that are not okay, not acceptable, because it's simply unfair. And I'm referring back to the things I mentioned earlier about forced technology transfer and also intellectual property theft, by the way, heavy industrial subsidies, and a growing role for state-owned enterprises. Again, if we had seen that they had been gradually diminished, the roles of state-owned enterprises, it would not have been such a problem, but we see the opposite. And you can read the reports from the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, because companies have sometimes problems complaining because they are afraid of retaliation if they are established in China and then complain. But through this report that we make once a year through the European Chamber of Commerce, you can get the replies anonymized, if you will. And they are saying we feel more discriminated against and less welcome. And we know that there are a number of sectors that are closed to investments from our companies, but whereas the Chinese have open as here in Europe. I mean, we are enormously open. We are, of course, putting some measures in place, and I'm sure that my colleague from Digitrade, Maria Martin Pratt, will talk about that when she gives a keynote speech soon about investment screening and other things. But let me say, by the way, that I do not take democracy for granted anywhere, not in the United States and not in Europe. I think we are seeing attacks on free media and independent court system. That is something we have to take seriously here too. On car tariffs. Well, we expect the US not to put car tariffs on us, since we are faithfully committed to working in this high-level executive working group, as I mentioned earlier. Is it a problem that the EU has launched a case in the WTO against these measures? Well, we simply didn't have a choice, because if the US says that it's a national security interest to have tariffs on steel and aluminium, even if the Department of Commerce said that there is no problem at all because we only use 3% of the steel that is produced in the US every year, we don't see a security interest problem. If they go ahead anyway, and now they threaten to do it with cars and car parts. Next time, maybe it's French wine that is a national security interest in the US. I mean, if they can decide themselves that anything is a national security interest, then it means that everything is a national security interest, and we don't have any rules anymore in the WTO or anywhere. So of course we had to take this case to court, and we would do it again if they launched tariffs on cars and car parts.
Thank you. Do you want just also to address this question of what do we put on the table, in the sense, as I understand it, that at least are we ready to take additional commitment to kind of improve the odds of any reform or any agreement?
Yes, how to get China to agree to new rules. But I think I have to confess I'm not aware about strange practices that our investment banks are engaged in. Frankly, I ignore that. But I think that China has very much to lose if the WTO would break down. I think they would lose more than anybody else. So I think they do have a vested interest in making this organization survive, and for that they will have to engage in rulemaking, and we have to engage with them. I think it is important that we talk to the Chinese, and we do it in a respectful way. We can't expect them to just simply sit and say yes, thank you to everything that we just propose. We have to work together. But I do think they have an interest here, and well, you may think that I'm over optimistic. I'm not saying that we are guaranteed to succeed, but we simply have to try. That's our duty. And then about Plan A and Plan B, yes, I recognize you from Paris conference last Friday. I also heard about, and we have also elaborated a bit in the Commission on possible Plan Bs, but I prefer not to talk about it too much. We really should invest now in making Plan A work. That is our really number one priority.
Some might say if the answer to engage China is somehow to use the threat put forward by the US, threatening the status quo, then why don't the European Union threat it even more to increase this incentive to negotiate?
Because we think that if we want to preserve a rules-based system, we should play within the rules.
Indeed. So, and we want to convince our trading partner also to stick to the rule-based system. Even China, of course, we have a lot of negotiations on investment, on geographical indication, and so on, so on. Step by step, we are working for that. By the way, on China, this would be also an item for another panel, but be realistic on Chinese investment, for example. So Volvo was rescued by Chinese investment, or the starter part of Bosch was also rescued by Chinese investment. Otherwise, we would have a lot of job losses in Europe. So let's be realistic. Of course, they have interests, but also we have interests, and this should be dealt in a proper way. Perhaps in a way which is respecting principles. And there we are back to the United States. So I have a problem at the moment that they are not really respecting the agreed principles. We discussed just on agriculture policy. We reformed our agriculture policy. We forbid the export subsidies for agriculture products and so on. Of course, there's also not something to do. But now, United States is attacking us, the green box, on Spanish olives. It's not a company case, it's a case on common agriculture policy. And looking to the whole picture, President Trump and Mr. Ross is also only focusing on trade in goods. What was the main interest in 1995 when founding WTO for the United States? It was services and it was TRIPS. And if you now look to surplus and services, which the United States has, and last year they got around about $80 billion fees for license and so on. And if you took all the elements together, then more or less the relation is balanced. So therefore, it's really complicated to discuss with them on a rational base at the moment. They have the strategic approach, and of course, as I mentioned before, let's talk, but it's not really on a rational base. And on Plan A and B, yes, let's try to stick to Plan A. Otherwise, some partners would be a little bit nervous if we are talking too much about Plan B. But at the end of the day, if at end of 2019 the EPI body will not be functioning anymore, then of course we have to reflect Plan B much more intensive. And to Politico, yes, we have to really get clarity on 232 from 1962 and on 301 from 1974, both long before WTO was founded. I want clarity which part of this legislation are covered by WTO ruling and which not.
Okay. If there is a burning, very short question, I'm ready to take it. Yes? Speak loud and hopefully everybody will hear you.
A colleague from the mission of China asked me some days ago, I should explain to him what vocational training is. I explained as far as I could. We are here in a German region. I explained it exists in Germany, in Austria, in the Netherlands. They will check it, and this is only one example how they are looking at successes here. And it would not surprise me if they may introduce a pilot phase with vocational training. Thank you.
Thank you. So an additional, very short, in a couple of sentences, please, and then we'll wrap up.
You highlighted regulatory cooperation as opposed to trying to get a more comprehensive tariffs deal done. But even with the pharma MRA that you mentioned, what's the holdup in picking these so-called low-hanging fruit and getting to quick wins that both Ambassador Lighthizer and Commissioner Malmström repeatedly talk about, but the initial guidance from the USTR was that end November we will have finalized a framework to press ahead with. That was after the September meeting. That November meeting took place, and we still have zero clarity as to which direction the negotiators are going at. So if you could elaborate a little bit, Maria, would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah. Do you want to elaborate on that?
I have my phone. Yes, microphone. No, thank you. I think there was a good meeting last week in Washington, D.C. when Commissioner Malmström was there to meet Ambassador Lighthizer. I think some time we spent on just explaining how our own system works, how the single market works and things, because now it's a new administration. It was a bit of a déjà vu for me, who have been there also during TTIP negotiations, but most of the people around the table are now new faces. So we have to invest a lot of time in explaining our respective systems to each other. But I think we are doing good progress. It was a stock-taking meeting. We did not put out any particular paper this time, but things are moving on. So fine. And I apologize, but I really have to go.
We're just in time to wrap up this session. Thanks a lot. We've understood that the challenges are daunting. We need to be pragmatic, but ambitious as well. Timing is everything. We are looking forward to the G20 meeting in a couple of weeks, but we should also think strategically to a decade down the road. Nothing less than all this at the same time. So thanks a lot to all of you for this excellent panel and for your attention. We deserved a good coffee. Thank you.